The phone call that shattered my world came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. I was still groggy from the anesthesia, my chest bandaged from the emergency cardiac surgery that had saved my life just 18 hours earlier. The hospital room was dark except for the glow of medical monitors, and I almost didn't answer when I saw my daughter's name on the screen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mom, we need to talk. Sophia's voice was different, too controlled, too rehearsed. There's been a development with the house situation. House situation? My heart rate spiked, causing the monitor to beep frantically. The Victorian manor on Elm Street had been my sanctuary for 28 years. Every ornate detail lovingly restored by my own hands during rare weekends off from Pacific Northwest Medical Center. What could possibly be wrong with my house while I was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from surgery that had nearly claimed my life? What kind of development? I managed to whisper, my throat still raw from the breathing tube. The silence stretched too long. Then Marcus, my eldest, took the phone. Mom, you know we've been worried about you living alone in that big house, especially after this heart attack scare. We made some decisions while you were unconscious. Decisions. The word hit me like a physical blow. What decisions could they possibly make about my life, my home, without me? We found a buyer for the house, Sophia's voice returned, artificially bright. A lovely family who'll take good care of it. The paperwork was finalized this morning. The room spun. Through the haze of medications and disbelief, I heard myself ask, "What do you mean, finalized?" "The house is sold, Mom. We used the power of attorney you signed before your surgery. Vincent helped us find the buyer. He knows the real estate market so well." Vincent. My ex-husband, who had walked out on our marriage 5 years ago for his 20-something assistant, Celeste. The man who had systematically dismantled our life together while I worked 80-hour weeks as a cardiac surgeon, building my reputation and saving lives. Now he was involved in selling my house while I fought for my life in an operating room? "You can't sell my house," I said, my voice gaining strength despite the pain radiating through my chest. "That's my home. I never authorized this." "Actually, Mom, you did," Marcus said, his lawyer voice kicking in. "The power of attorney was comprehensive. We did what we thought was best." Best for whom? I wanted to scream, but the heart monitor was already going crazy, and a nurse was rushing in to check on me. "Mrs. Moreau, you need to stay calm," the nurse said, adjusting my IV. "Your heart rate is dangerously elevated." As the sedative flooded my system, I heard Sophia's voice through the phone speaker, now lying on the hospital bed beside me. "We'll talk more when you're feeling better, Mom. Try to rest. Everything is going to be fine." But everything was not fine. As consciousness slipped away, one thought burned in my mind. My own children had sold my house while I was fighting for my life. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. 3 days later, when I was finally coherent enough to process what had happened, I learned the full extent of their betrayal. Not only had Marcus and Sophia sold my house, but they had sold it to Vincent and Celeste for a fraction of its market value. My Victorian manor, worth nearly $1 million, had been transferred for $400,000, a family deal that would allow Vincent to finally give his young wife the grand home she'd always coveted. The home I had purchased, with my own money, restored with my own hands, and filled with memories of raising my children as a single mother while building one of the most respected cardiac surgery practices on the West Coast. I am Diana Moreau, and for 35 years, I have been a cardiac surgeon at Pacific Northwest Medical Center. Not just any cardiac surgeon, I am the head of the cardiac surgery department, the woman who pioneered a revolutionary minimally invasive heart surgery technique that has saved thousands of lives worldwide. But to my children, I was apparently just an aging woman who couldn't be trusted to manage her own affairs. The irony was not lost on me. While I was lying on an operating table, my own heart being repaired by my colleague Dr. Franklin Pierce, my children were across town signing papers to give away the home I had earned through decades of saving lives. The same hands that had performed over 3,000 successful heart surgeries had spent weekends refinishing the Victorian's original hardwood floors, restoring the stained glass windows, and cultivating the medicinal herb garden that had become my refuge from the stress of the operating room. My journey to this moment of betrayal began 40 years ago, when I was a young medical student, one of only 3 women in my surgical program. While my male classmates were encouraged to pursue prestigious specialties, I was repeatedly told that cardiac surgery was too demanding, too stressful, too physically challenging for a woman. The hours were brutal, the pressure immense, and the old boys' network nearly impenetrable. I proved them all wrong. By the time I was 30, I had completed my residency and fellowship with honors, despite the constant undermining from professors who questioned whether a woman could handle the emotional demands of holding a human heart in her hands. By 35, I had developed a surgical technique that revolutionized how we approach certain types of heart defects, reducing recovery time by 60% and virtually eliminating the need for open-heart surgery in many cases. But success? In medicine, I learned, came at a price. While I was establishing myself as one of the premier cardiac surgeons in the Pacific Northwest, my marriage to Vincent was slowly dying. He was a commercial real estate developer, successful in his own right, but he increasingly resented my long hours, my dedication to my patients, and especially the recognition I received for my medical innovations. "You care more about your patients than your own family," he would say during our increasingly frequent arguments. "When was the last time you were home for dinner? When was the last time you took a vacation that wasn't to a medical conference?" He wasn't entirely wrong. I did work long hours. I did miss family dinners and school events. But I was saving lives, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in cardiac surgery, and building a legacy that would outlast all of us. I thought Vincent understood that my work was not just a career, but a calling. I was wrong about that too. The children, Marcus and Sophia, grew up in our beautiful Victorian home, surrounded by the luxury that 2 successful careers could provide. But they saw their mother primarily as a figure who appeared briefly at breakfast, kissed them goodbye, and returned home exhausted after long days in the operating room. Vincent, to his credit, was more present in their daily lives, attending their school functions and soccer games, helping with homework, and filling the role I couldn't always fulfill. Perhaps that's why, when our marriage finally ended 5 years ago, the children sided with their father. They saw him as the parent who had been there for them, while I was the absent mother who chose work over family. The truth, as it often is, was more complicated. I had worked those long hours not just for my own ambition, but to provide for our family, to ensure Marcus and Sophia could attend the best schools, take music lessons, travel to Europe in the summers, and eventually graduate from college debt-free. Vincent's decision to leave me for Celeste Hartwell, his 28-year-old assistant, came just as I was receiving the biggest recognition of my career. The American Heart Association had selected me to receive their Lifetime Achievement Award for my contributions to cardiac surgery. The ceremony was scheduled for the same weekend Vincent moved out of our home. "I can't live in your shadow anymore. Diana," he told me as he packed his belongings, "I need to be with someone who makes me feel like a priority." Celeste, with her youth and her willingness to worship at the altar of Vincent's ego, certainly fit that description. She looked at him as if he hung the moon, laughed at his jokes, and most importantly, didn't have a career that overshadowed his own achievements. She was content to be his beautiful accessory, to plan his social calendar, and to dream of the day when they could live in a grand house that reflected his success. My Victorian manor, it turned out, was exactly what she had in mind. The divorce, Proceedings were amicable, if you could call the systematic dismantling of a 28-year marriage amicable. Vincent kept his real estate business and his downtown condo. I kept the house, my medical practice, and most of our savings. The children, both adults by then, split their time between us, though I sensed their loyalty lay more with their father than with me. Marcus had followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a real estate attorney who specialized in commercial development. Sophia had pursued a career in marketing, working for a firm that handled high-end residential properties. Both were successful in their own right, but both had absorbed Vincent's narrative that my career had somehow damaged our family. "You were never really present, Mom," Sophia had said during one of our rare heart-to-heart conversations after the divorce. "Dad was the one who made sure we felt loved and supported. You were always at the hospital." Her words stung because they contained a grain of truth. I had missed bedtime stories and soccer games. I had worked through family vacations and missed important milestones. But I had also saved thousands of lives, advanced medical science, and built a legacy that would continue long after I was gone. Wasn't that worth something? Apparently not to my children, who saw my professional achievements as evidence of my failure as a mother. After the divorce, I threw myself even more deeply into my work. I took on the most challenging cases, mentored young surgeons, and continued to refine my surgical techniques. The Victorian manor became my sanctuary, a place where I could tend to my herb garden, read medical journals by the fireplace, and find peace after the intensity of the operating room. The house was more than just a residence. It was a reflection of everything I had worked to achieve. Every room had been carefully restored to its original Victorian splendor, but with modern amenities that made it both beautiful and functional. The kitchen, where I had spent countless hours cooking elaborate meals for family gatherings that became less frequent after the divorce, featured original cabinetry that I had stripped and refinished myself. The library, lined with medical texts and rare books on surgical history, had become my favorite room, where I would spend quiet evenings reviewing cases or preparing for lectures. The garden was perhaps my greatest pride. What had started as a neglected backyard had been transformed into a sophisticated medicinal herb garden with varieties of plants used in traditional healing practices from around the world. I had studied botany as a hobby, fascinated by the intersection of natural remedies and modern medicine. The garden had become a source of both beauty and scientific inquiry, a place where I could nurture life in a different way than I did in the operating room. This was the home my children had sold while I was unconscious, fighting for my life. The betrayal went deeper than just the sale of the house. It was the assumption that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions, that my age and my recent heart attack had somehow rendered me incompetent. At 62, I was at the peak of my surgical career, still performing complex operations that younger surgeons wouldn't attempt. My mind was sharp, my hands steady, and my reputation unimpeachable. Yet my own children had decided that I needed to be managed, that my life needed to be simplified, that I should be transitioned into some kind of assisted living situation without my knowledge or consent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The power of attorney they referenced had been signed hastily before my emergency surgery when I was in the grip of a massive heart attack and barely conscious. The document was meant to ensure that someone could make medical decisions if I couldn't, not to give them carte blanche to restructure my entire life while I was unconscious. As I lay in that hospital bed, recovering from surgery and processing the magnitude of what had happened, I realized that my children saw me not as Dr. Diana Moreau, the pioneering cardiac surgeon, but as an elderly woman who had become a burden. They had looked at my life and decided it needed to be simplified, my independence curtailed, my choices made for me. They had gravely underestimated who they were dealing with, what Marcus and Sophia didn't know, what Vincent and Celeste didn't know, was that I had been working on something for the past 5 years that would change everything. While they saw me as a woman whose best days were behind her, I had been quietly developing a revolutionary new surgical technique that would transform cardiac surgery worldwide. The Moreau method, as it was being called in medical circles, was a breakthrough approach to treating complex heart defects that had previously been considered inoperable. Using advanced imaging technology and microsurgical techniques, I had developed a way to repair the heart through incisions smaller than a postage stamp, with recovery times that were a fraction of traditional open-heart surgery. The technique was still in clinical trials, but the preliminary results were so promising that the Sterling Medical Research Institute in Seattle had offered me a 3-year, $2 million research grant to further develop and implement the method. The grant came with the condition that I would establish a new cardiac surgery center, train other surgeons in the technique, and oversee its implementation in hospitals across the country. I had been planning to accept the grant and use it to establish my legacy, to ensure that my life's work would continue to save lives long after I retired. The Moreau method would be my gift to the medical world, a technique that would make cardiac surgery safer, faster, and more accessible to patients who previously had no options. But my children's betrayal had changed everything. They wanted to simplify my life, to force me into retirement, to treat me as if my most productive years were behind me. They had no idea that I was on the verge of the greatest achievement of my career. As I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and feeling the betrayal burn in my chest alongside the pain from my surgery, I made a decision. I would not go quietly into the retirement they had planned for me. I would not accept their narrative that I was too old, too frail, too much of a burden to continue living my life on my own terms. I would show them exactly who Diana Moreau really was. The first step was getting out of the hospital and finding a place to live. My children had thoughtfully arranged for me to move into Sunset Manor, a luxury assisted living facility that would provide all the support and social activities I needed. The brochure they had left on my bedside table featured happy seniors playing bingo, taking painting classes, and enjoying communal meals in a dining room that looked more like a cafeteria than a restaurant. I threw the brochure in the trash. Instead, I called my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Adrienne Walsh, who had been my closest confidant throughout my career. Adrienne had retired from surgery 2 years earlier, but remained active in medical research and advocacy. She was one of the few people who knew about the Moreau method and the Sterling grant offer. "Diana, I heard about your surgery," she said when she answered the phone. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been betrayed by my own children," I said, and then I told her everything. Adrienne listened in shocked silence as I described how Marcus and Sophia had sold my house while I was unconscious, how they had made arrangements for me to live in assisted living, how they had essentially decided that my life as I knew it was over. "They have no idea what they've done," Adrienne said when I finished. "Do they know about the Sterling grant?" "They don't know about any of it," I replied. "They see me as an old woman who needs to be managed, not as a surgeon who's on the verge of revolutionizing cardiac surgery." "Well," Adrienne said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, "I think it's time they learned who their mother really is, and I think I know just the place for you to stay while you figure out your next move." Adrienne's offer was exactly what I needed. She owned a small craftsman cottage in the Millbrook district, a charming neighborhood near the university, where she had planned to retire. The cottage was currently vacant, and she was happy to let me stay there while I recovered from my surgery and planned my next steps. "Consider it your headquarters," she said. "A place where you can regroup and show your children that you're far from finished." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the thrill of the fight. My children thought they had checkmated me, that they had successfully managed my life transition into gentle decline. They had no idea that they had just awakened a sleeping giant. Dr. Diana Moreau was not ready to be put out to pasture. In fact, she was just getting started. The next morning, I checked myself out of the hospital against medical advice, much to the consternation of the nursing staff. I called a taxi to take me to Adrian's cottage, where I would begin planning my counterattack. I had work to do, a legacy to secure, and a lesson to teach my children about underestimating their mother. They thought they knew who I was. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The Craftsman Cottage in Millbrook turned out to be exactly what I needed, a sanctuary where I could heal both physically and emotionally while planning my response to my children's treachery. The house was small, but beautifully appointed, with built-in bookshelves, hardwood floors, and large windows that let in the soft Oregon light. Adrian had furnished it with comfortable pieces that felt like a warm embrace after the sterile hospital environment. My first week there was a blur of pain medication, physical therapy sessions, and long conversations with Adrian about what had happened. She would arrive each morning with fresh coffee and pastries from the local bakery, settling into the armchair across from my spot on the sofa, where I was still recovering from the surgery. "I keep thinking about that power of attorney," I said, during one of our morning talks. How could a document meant to protect me during surgery be used to destroy my entire life? Adrian shook her head in disgust. "Because they saw an opportunity and took it. Vincent probably coached them on exactly how to exploit that legal loophole." The mention of Vincent's involvement made my blood pressure spike. My ex-husband had always been calculating, always looking for angles and advantages. During our marriage, I had dismissed his manipulative tendencies as business acumen, but now I could see how he had orchestrated this entire scenario. He had wanted my Victorian manor for years, had made comments about how Celeste deserved to live in a proper house befitting his success. When my heart attack presented an opportunity, he had used our children as his instruments. "The worst part," I told Adrian, "is that Marcus and Sophia genuinely believe they were helping me. They've convinced themselves that selling my house was an act of love, not betrayal." "That's what makes it so insidious," she replied. "Vincent has manipulated them into thinking they're the heroes of this story." During those first difficult days of recovery, I began to understand the full scope of what my children had taken from me. It wasn't just the house, though losing my sanctuary of 28 years was devastating enough. They had stripped away my autonomy, my right to make decisions about my own life, my dignity as an accomplished professional who deserved respect. The Victorian manor had been more than just a residence. It was the physical manifestation of everything I had worked to achieve. Every room told a story of my journey from struggling medical student to respected surgeon. The library where I had studied for countless hours, preparing for board certifications and researching new surgical techniques. The kitchen where I had hosted dinner parties for medical colleagues, building the professional relationships that had advanced my career. The garden where I had found peace after losing patients, where I had celebrated successful surgeries, where I had mourned the end of my marriage. Each morning as I sat in Adrian's cottage, drinking coffee and looking out at the small but lovely garden, I mourned not just the loss of my house, but the loss of my independence. My children had decided that a 62-year-old woman who had just suffered a heart attack was no longer capable of managing her own affairs. They saw frailty where there was temporary illness, decline where there was simply a medical event that thousands of people survive and recover from completely. What they didn't understand, what Vincent certainly didn't understand, was that my heart attack had been caused by a rare genetic condition that had nothing to do with age or lifestyle. I had been born with a small defect in one of my heart valves, a condition that had remained asymptomatic for decades until stress and overwork had finally triggered a crisis. The surgery had repaired the defect completely, and my prognosis was excellent. Within 6 months, I would be cleared to return to full surgical duties. But my children had seen only what they wanted to see, an aging mother who needed to be managed and contained. The irony was particularly bitter, because I had spent my entire career fighting against exactly this kind of dismissal. The medical profession had been skeptical of women surgeons when I entered the field. constantly questioning our physical strength, our emotional stability, our ability to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. I had proven them wrong through decades of excellent outcomes, innovative techniques, and tireless dedication to my patients. Now, my own children were treating me with the same patronizing attitude I had fought against my entire career. As my physical strength began to return, I started making phone calls to understand exactly what legal rights I had. The attorney I consulted, Benjamin Torres, was a specialist in elder law and financial exploitation. When I described what had happened, his response was immediate and reassuring. "Mrs. Moreau, what your children did may have been technically legal, but it was ethically questionable at best," he said during our first consultation. "A power of attorney for medical decisions should not have been used to make major financial transactions without your explicit consent." "But they claim the document was comprehensive," I protested. "Let me see the actual language," he said. Power of attorney documents can be written broadly, but there are still limitations on what actions can be taken without specific authorization. When Benjamin reviewed the document I had signed in my hospital bed, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is broader than it should be for a medical power of attorney," he admitted. "But there's still a question of whether selling your primary residence at below market value to family members constitutes acting in your best interest." "Below market value?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Your house was appraised at $950,000 just 6 months ago for insurance purposes. They sold it for $400,000. That's not a family discount. That's potential fraud." The number hit me like a physical blow. My children hadn't just given away my house. They had essentially given Vincent and Celeste a gift of more than $500,000. Money that should have been mine, that I had earned through decades of saving lives and building my reputation. "What are my options?" I asked. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, considering. "We can challenge the sale on several grounds. The power of attorney may have been improperly applied. The sale price suggests the transaction wasn't in your best interest, and there are questions about whether you were mentally competent to sign such a broad document while experiencing a cardiac emergency. How long would a legal challenge take? Months, possibly years, and it would be expensive. Your children would likely hire their own attorneys, and Vincent certainly has the resources for a protracted legal battle." I left Benjamin's office, feeling discouraged but not defeated. A legal challenge would be slow and costly, and there was no guarantee of success. But I had other options, other ways to respond to what my children had done. That evening, I called Dr. Franklin Pierce, the head of the Sterling Medical Research Institute. Franklin and I had known each other for 15 years, ever since we had worked together on a groundbreaking study of cardiac valve repair techniques. He was one of the few people in the medical world who fully understood the potential of the Moreau method. "Diana," he said when he heard my voice, "I heard about your surgery. How are you recovering?" "Better than expected," I said. "Franklin, I'm ready to discuss the research grant." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I thought you were considering retirement. Your assistant said you needed time to think about the offer." My assistant. I had forgotten that. All my professional communications were being filtered through my office at the hospital, where Marcus and Sophia had apparently been fielding calls on my behalf. They had been managing my professional life as well as my personal life, making decisions about my career without consulting me. "I've changed my mind," I said firmly. "I want to accept the grant and establish the Cardiac Surgery Center. When can we meet?" "How about next week? I can drive down from Seattle, or you can come up here if you're feeling up to the travel." "I'll come to Seattle," I said. "I'm stronger than people think." After hanging up, I sat in Adrienne's living room and began to formulate a plan. My children wanted to force me into retirement, to make me disappear quietly into assisted living where I would no longer be an inconvenience. Instead, I was going to accept the most prestigious research grant of my career and establish myself as one of the leading cardiac surgeons in the world. The sterling grant would provide me with resources I had never dreamed of having: a state-of-the-art research facility, a team of the best young surgeons in the country, and the funding to conduct clinical trials that would prove the effectiveness of the Moreau method once and for all. But first, I needed to understand exactly how extensively my children had interfered with my life while I was recovering from surgery. The next morning, I called my office at Pacific Northwest Medical Center. My assistant, Janet, had been with me for 8 years and knew my schedule, my preferences, and my professional commitments better than anyone. "Dr. Moreau," she said, her voice filled with relief. "I'm so glad to hear from you. I've been so worried." "Janet, I need to know what communications you've received on my behalf since my surgery. Your son Marcus called several times, asking about your schedule and your pending commitments. He said you were too ill to take calls and that he was handling your affairs temporarily." "What did you tell him?" "I gave him information about your upcoming surgeries and conference presentations. He said he would need to cancel everything because you were retiring for health reasons." My stomach dropped. "What conferences?" "The International Cardiac Surgery Symposium in Vancouver next month. You were scheduled to present your research on minimally invasive valve repair. Marcus said you wouldn't be able to attend." The Vancouver Symposium was one of the most prestigious conferences in cardiac surgery, attended by the leading surgeons from around the world. My presentation was going to be the first public unveiling of some aspects of the Moreau method, a chance to establish myself as the pioneer of this revolutionary technique. "Janet, I need you to call the conference organizers immediately. Tell them I will be attending and presenting as scheduled." "Dr. Moreau, are you sure? Marcus seemed very concerned about your health." "Marcus was misinformed about my condition," I said firmly. "I'm recovering well and fully intend to resume my professional commitments." After hanging up, I realized that my children's interference had been even more extensive than I had initially understood. They hadn't just sold my house and planned my living arrangements. They had begun dismantling my professional life as well, canceling commitments and telling people I was too ill to continue my career. The pattern was becoming clear. Marcus and Sophia, probably with Vincent's guidance, had decided that my heart attack was the perfect opportunity to force me into retirement. They would sell my house, move me into assisted living, wind down my medical practice, and transition me into the role of harmless elderly mother who posed no threat to anyone's self-image. What they hadn't counted on was my resilience, my determination, and my complete unwillingness to go quietly into the diminished life they had planned for me. That afternoon, I drove to my bank to assess my financial situation. The sale of my house had generated $400,000, which had been deposited into my account by the title company. It was far less than the house was worth, but it was still a substantial sum that would give me options. The bank manager, Susan Kim, had handled my accounts for years and knew me well. When I explained what had happened, her expression grew increasingly concerned. "Dr. Moreau, I have to ask, did you authorize this transaction?" "Not explicitly. My children used a power of attorney that was broader than it should have been." Susan pulled up my account information on her computer. "The good news is that the money is in your account, so you have control over it now. But I have to tell you, we've had several inquiries about your accounts in the past week." "What kind of inquiries?" "Your son Marcus called asking about your investment portfolio and your retirement accounts. He said he was helping you transition into retirement and needed to understand your financial position." The violation felt complete. My children hadn't just taken my house. They had been investigating my entire financial life, presumably to make more decisions on my behalf. "Susan, I need you to put additional security measures on all my accounts. No one should have access to information about my finances except me, regardless of what power of attorney documents they claim to have." "Absolutely, Dr. Moreau. I'll make sure everything is locked down." As I left the bank, I felt a familiar sensation that I hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of preparing for a complex surgery. Just as I would methodically plan every step of a cardiac procedure, I was now planning my response to my children's betrayal. Each element had to be perfectly coordinated, each move calculated for maximum impact. My first priority was establishing my independence. I needed a place to live that reflected my status and accomplishments, not the diminished circumstances my children had envisioned for me. Adrian's cottage was perfect for recovery, but it wasn't a permanent solution. I spent the next few days looking at properties in the University District, an area filled with beautiful older homes that attracted professors and professionals. The neighborhood had character and sophistication, nothing like the sterile environment of Sunset Manor that my children had selected for me. I found exactly what I was looking for on Maple Street. A beautifully restored Edwardian home with original hardwood floors, built-in bookcases, and a stunning garden. The house had been owned by a retired literature professor who had maintained it impeccably. It was smaller than my Victorian manor, but far more elegant than anything my children thought I deserved. The asking price was $350,000, almost exactly what I could afford with the proceeds from my forced house sale. It felt like poetic justice to use the money from Vincent and Celeste's bargain purchase to buy myself a home that was everything theirs wasn't. Tasteful, sophisticated, and genuinely beautiful rather than merely expensive. I made an offer that afternoon and had it accepted by evening. While the purchase was being finalized, I began reaching out to colleagues and professional contacts, rebuilding the network that my children had attempted to dismantle. I called the conference organizers in Vancouver to confirm my presentation, scheduled meetings with department heads at Pacific Northwest Medical Center to discuss my return to full surgical duties, and began preliminary conversations with the Sterling Institute about the research grant. Each phone call was a small act of rebellion against the narrative my children had constructed. They had told people I was too frail to continue my career, that I was retiring for health reasons, that I needed to be managed and protected. Instead, I was demonstrating that I was not only capable of managing my own affairs, but was about to embark on the most ambitious phase of my career. The response from my colleagues was universally positive. Everyone who knew my work understood that the Moreau method represented a breakthrough in cardiac surgery, and the Sterling grant was recognition of my standing in the field. The idea that I would retire at the peak of my influence seemed absurd to anyone who understood my professional accomplishments. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the chief of surgery at Pacific Northwest Medical Center, was particularly supportive when I met with her to discuss my return. "Diana, I have to be honest. When your son called to say you were retiring for health reasons, I was skeptical. You've never been one to back down from a challenge, and your research has been groundbreaking. I'm relieved to hear you're continuing your work." Did Marcus provide any specifics about my supposed retirement? Patricia looked uncomfortable. "He said your heart attack had been more serious than initially thought, that you were experiencing cognitive issues related to the surgery, and that the family felt it was best for you to step back from your responsibilities." Cognitive issues. My children had not only sold my house and planned my living arrangements, they had told my professional colleagues that I was mentally impaired. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I had spent my entire career proving that I was capable, competent, and intellectually superior to most of my peers. Now my own children were telling people that my mind was failing. "Patricia, I want you to schedule me for surgery as soon as my cardiac clearance comes through. I want everyone to see that there are no cognitive issues, no decline in my abilities. Of course, Diana, I never doubted your capabilities." As I left Patricia's office, I realized that my children's betrayal had given me something unexpected: absolute clarity about what I needed to do. They had tried to diminish me, to force me into a smaller life, to make me disappear into the margins of respectability. Instead, I was going to become more visible, more accomplished, and more influential than I had ever been before. The Vancouver conference was just the beginning. I would present the Moreau method to the international surgical community, accept the Sterling grant publicly, and establish myself as one of the leading innovators in cardiac surgery. My children wanted me to retire quietly. Instead, I was going to have the most successful year of my career. As I drove back to Adrian's cottage that evening, I thought about Marcus and Sophia, probably planning my smooth transition into Sunset Manor, confident that they had successfully managed their troublesome mother's decline into old age. They had no idea what was coming. The paperwork for my new house would be finalized within the week. The Vancouver conference was just 3 weeks away. The Sterling grant would be announced publicly within the month. My children thought they had checkmated me. Instead, they had simply motivated me to play the game at a level they couldn't even comprehend. Dr. Diana Moreau was about to remind the world exactly who she was. The confrontation I had been avoiding finally came 2 weeks after I discovered the full extent of my children's deception. I was in my new Edwardian home, unpacking boxes of medical journals and surgical instruments, when I heard the familiar sound of Marcus's Mercedes pulling into the driveway. Through the front window, I watched as both my children emerged from the car, their faces grim with determination. Sophia carried a manila folder thick with documents, while Marcus wore his lawyer expression, the one he used when he was about to deliver bad news with professional detachment. They had clearly coordinated this visit, probably at Vincent's suggestion, to address what they undoubtedly saw as my increasingly erratic behavior. I met them at the front door before they could ring the bell. "This is unexpected," I said, not inviting them in. "Mom, we need to talk," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same patronizing tone he had used during our phone call at the hospital. "We're concerned about some decisions you've been making." "Decisions like buying a house without consulting you?" I asked. "Or perhaps decisions like planning to return to work instead of retiring gracefully?" Sophia shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for my directness. "We heard you've been telling people you're going back to surgery. Mom, that's not realistic given your condition." "My condition is excellent, thank you for asking. My cardiologist cleared me for full activity last week." I pulled the medical clearance form from my pocket and handed it to Marcus. "Perhaps you'd like to review the documentation before making any more decisions about my health care." Marcus scanned the document, his expression growing more frustrated. "This doesn't change the fact that you've been making impulsive choices. Buying this house, rejecting the assisted living arrangement we made for you, telling your colleagues that we lied about your retirement." "You did lie about my retirement," I interrupted. "You told Patricia Hendricks that I was experiencing cognitive issues. You canceled my conference presentations. You've been systematically dismantling my professional life without my knowledge or consent." "We were protecting you," Sophia said, her voice rising. "You had a heart attack, Mom. You could have died. We thought you would want us to handle things so you could focus on recovery." "Protecting me by selling my house to your father for half its market value? Protecting me by moving me into a facility where I'd be treated like an invalid? Protecting me by telling my colleagues that my mind was failing?" The siblings exchanged glances, and I could see them realizing that I knew far more than they had expected. They had underestimated my ability to investigate what they had done, to rebuild the professional relationships they had tried to damage. "The house sale was necessary," Marcus said, falling back on his legal training. "You were living alone in a property that was too large and expensive to maintain. The assisted living facility has excellent medical support and social activities. It was the practical choice." "Practical for whom? For you and Vincent and Celeste, who got $1 million house for $400,000? Or practical for me, the woman who spent 28 years creating a home and a life that you decided to dismantle while I was unconscious?" Sophia opened the manila folder and pulled out several documents. "Mom, we've been talking to a geriatric psychiatrist about your behavior since the surgery. Dr. Williams says that cardiac events can sometimes cause personality changes, increased paranoia, difficulty accepting help from family members. I stared at the papers she was holding. You've been discussing my mental health with a psychiatrist, without my knowledge or consent? We're worried about you, Marcus said. This house purchase, your insistence on returning to work, your anger toward us, it's not like you. Doctor. Williams thinks you might benefit from medication to help with the adjustment to retirement. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I couldn't speak. My children hadn't just sold my house and planned my living arrangements. They had consulted a psychiatrist about medicating me into compliance with their vision of my life. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, please. Get out of my house, now. But they didn't move. Instead, Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. We've been recording this conversation, Mom. Dr. Williams said documentation of your behavior would be helpful if we need to seek legal guardianship. Legal guardianship. The words hit me like a physical blow. My children were planning to have me declared incompetent so they could control every aspect of my life. The house sale had been just the beginning. You want to have me declared incompetent? I asked, my voice deadly calm. We want to help you, Sophia said, tears in her eyes. We want to make sure you're safe and taken care of. You're not thinking clearly, Mom. You're making decisions that could hurt you. The only people who have hurt me are standing in my living room right now, I said. You sold my house. You've been telling people I'm mentally impaired. You've been sabotaging my career, and now you want to take away my legal rights as well. If that's what it takes to protect you from yourself, Marcus said, his lawyer persona fully engaged. That's when I realized that my children were no longer the people I had raised. They had become strangers who saw me not as their accomplished mother but as an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved. Vincent had poisoned them against me so thoroughly that they genuinely believed they were acting in my best interest. I want you to leave now, I said. And I want you to understand something very clearly. I am not the helpless old woman you think I am. I am Dr. Diana Moreau, one of the leading cardiac surgeons in the country, and I will not be managed or medicated, or declared incompetent by my own children. Mom, Sophia began. I said leave. They left, but not before Marcus placed a business card on my coffee table. Dr. Williams is available to meet with you whenever you're ready. We just want what's best for you. After they were gone, I sat in my empty library, surrounded by boxes of books and medical journals, and tried to process what had just happened. My children weren't just betraying me. They were systematically attempting to destroy my autonomy, my professional identity, and my legal rights. The psychiatric evaluation was particularly insidious. By consulting a geriatric psychiatrist and documenting my concerning behavior, they were building a case for incompetency that could be used to strip away my right to make decisions about my own life. The house purchase, my return to work, my anger at their betrayal. All of it was being reframed as evidence of mental decline rather than reasonable responses to their actions. I picked up Dr. Williams's business card and stared at it. Marcus and Sophia had found a psychiatrist willing to pathologize my refusal to accept their control, to medicalize my insistence on maintaining my independence. That's when I decided that subtle resistance wasn't enough. My children wanted a war, and I was going to give them one. The next morning, I called Dr. Franklin Pierce at the Sterling Medical Research Institute. Franklin, I want to move up our timeline for the grant. Announcement. How quickly can we schedule a press conference? A press conference? He sounded surprised. Diana, we usually handle these grants through quiet professional channels. Are you sure you want media attention? I'm absolutely sure. I want every medical journal, every newspaper, every news outlet to know that Dr. Diana Moreau has received the largest cardiac surgery research grant in the history of the Sterling Institute. That's quite a departure from your usual preference for privacy. My circumstances have changed, I said. I need the world to know exactly who I am and what I've accomplished. Franklin agreed to coordinate a press conference for the following week. The Sterling Institute had been planning to announce the grant in their quarterly newsletter, but they were happy to generate more publicity for their investment in groundbreaking cardiac research. My next call was to the organizers of the Vancouver conference. I want to change my presentation, I told Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the conference chair. Instead of discussing minimally invasive valve repair, I want to present the complete Moreau method. The complete method? Diana, that's your life's work. Are you sure you want to reveal everything publicly? I'm sure. I want every cardiac surgeon in the world to know that this technique exists and that I developed it. That would be the keynote presentation of the conference, the one that gets covered by all the medical journals and news outlets. Perfect. After hanging up, I realized that I was doing something I had never done before in my career, actively seeking publicity and recognition. For decades, I had worked quietly, publishing my research under modest titles, presenting at conferences without fanfare, letting my work speak for itself. I had been content to let others take credit as long as the work got done and patients benefited. But my children's betrayal had changed everything. They had tried to erase me, to make me disappear into the comfortable invisibility of retirement and assisted living. Instead, I was going to make myself more visible than I had ever been before. The press conference was scheduled for the following Thursday at the Sterling Institute in Seattle. Franklin had arranged for representatives from medical journals, healthcare publications, and local news outlets to attend. The announcement would be that Dr. Diana Moreau had received a $3.2 million research grant to establish a new cardiac surgery center and train surgeons worldwide in the revolutionary Moreau method. But I wasn't finished. If my children wanted to play hardball, I was going to show them what a real power play looked like. I called Benjamin Torres, my attorney, and scheduled an appointment for the next day. Benjamin, I want to explore all my legal options regarding the house sale and my children's behavior. Have you reconsidered pursuing a legal challenge to the sale? No, I want to do something more comprehensive. I want to sue my children for financial elder abuse, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Diana, that's a very serious step. Are you certain you want to take legal action against your own children? They've consulted a psychiatrist about having me declared incompetent. They've told my colleagues that I'm mentally impaired. They've systematically attempted to destroy my professional reputation and my personal autonomy. Yes, I'm certain. The case would be complex and it would be very public. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I'm prepared for whatever it takes to protect myself and my rights. Benjamin agreed to research the legal options and prepare a preliminary case. He warned me that the lawsuit would be expensive and time-consuming, but I had the resources to pursue it and the determination to see it through. My final call was to Carmen Rodriguez, my neighbor from the Victorian manor. Carmen had been a friend for years, and I knew she had been horrified by what my children had done. Carmen, I need a favor. I want you to document everything you observed about the house sale. Who came to look at the property, what condition it was in, any conversations you overheard. Diana, I've been so angry about what happened to you. Marcus and Sophia brought potential buyers through while you were still in the hospital. They were showing off the house like it was already theirs to sell. I need you to write all of that down. I'm going to use it as evidence. Evidence? For what? I'm suing my children for elder abuse and defamation. I'm not going to let them get away with what they've done. Carmen was quiet for a moment. Good for you, Diana. Someone needs to stand up to them. Over the next few days, I prepared for the press conference with the same methodical approach I used for complex surgeries. I wrote out my remarks, practiced my presentation, and coordinated with Franklin to ensure that every detail was perfect. The press conference would accomplish several goals simultaneously. It would establish my professional credentials and mental competence in the most public way possible. It would demonstrate that I was not the failing, confused old woman my children had described to their psychiatrist, and it would position me as one of the leading cardiac surgeons in the world, someone whose expertise was recognized by the most prestigious medical institutions. But the press conference was just the opening move. The Vancouver presentation would be even more significant, establishing the Moreau method as my legacy and cementing my reputation as a pioneer in cardiac surgery. The lawsuit would force my children to answer for their behavior in court, where their manipulation and deception would be exposed for what it was. I was no longer just defending myself against my children's betrayal. I was going on the offensive, using every resource at my disposal to protect my rights and my reputation. The morning of the press conference, I dressed carefully in my best suit, the one I wore for important surgeries and formal presentations. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a successful, accomplished professional at the peak of her career. As I drove to Seattle, I thought about Marcus and Sophia, probably planning their next move in their campaign to have me declared incompetent. They had no idea that their mother was about to become one of the most visible cardiac surgeons in the country. The Sterling Institute's main conference room was packed with reporters, medical journalists, and representatives from healthcare organizations. Franklin introduced me with glowing praise for my contributions to cardiac surgery, emphasizing my innovations and the potential impact of the Moreau method. When I stepped to the podium, I felt a familiar rush of adrenaline, the same feeling I got before performing a complex surgery. This was what I had been born to do: stand before my peers and present groundbreaking medical research that would save lives. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, I am Dr. Diana Moreau, and I am here to announce the most significant advancement in cardiac surgery in the past decade. For the next 30 minutes, I presented the Moreau method in detail, explaining how the technique could revolutionize cardiac surgery by making complex procedures less invasive, reducing recovery times, and improving outcomes for patients who previously had no options. The questions from the audience were sharp and informed, exactly the kind of professional scrutiny I thrived on. I answered each one with precision and confidence, demonstrating not only my expertise, but my mental acuity and professional competence. When a reporter from the Seattle Times asked about my age and whether I planned to retire soon, I smiled. I'm 62 years old. I've just received the largest research grant in my field, and I'm about to establish a new cardiac surgery center that will train surgeons worldwide. Does that sound like retirement to you? The room erupted in laughter, and I knew I had made my point. This was not a woman who was mentally impaired or ready to be put out to pasture. This was a surgeon at the height of her powers, embarking on the most ambitious project of her career. After the press conference, Franklin walked me to my car. That was brilliant, Diana. The coverage is going to be extensive. Every medical journal will want to interview you. Good, I said. I want as much visibility as possible. Can I ask what's driving this sudden desire for publicity? You've always been private about your work. I looked back at the Sterling Institute, where reporters were still filing their stories about the revolutionary cardiac surgeon who was changing the field. Let's just say I've learned that sometimes you have to fight for recognition. Sometimes you have to make sure the world knows exactly who you are. As I drove back to Oregon, I thought about my children and their psychiatrist friend, probably still planning their competency hearing. They had no idea that their supposedly impaired mother had just held a press conference that would be covered by every major medical publication in the country. The war they had started was about to become very public, and I was going to win it decisively. By the time I reached my Edwardian home, The first news reports were already online. "Pioneering cardiac surgeon receives record grant," read the headline in Medical News Today. "Revolutionary heart surgery technique could transform treatment," announced the American Heart Association's newsletter. My phone was ringing constantly, with interview requests, conference invitations, and congratulations from colleagues around the world. The quiet, private Dr. Diana Moreau was gone, replaced by a woman who was determined to claim her rightful place in medical history. Marcus and Sophia had tried to erase me. Instead, they had created a monster. A surgeon with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The Vancouver conference was just 2 weeks away. The lawsuit would be filed within the month, and every day, more medical professionals would learn about the Moreau method and the woman who had developed it. My children wanted to declare me incompetent. The world was about to discover just how competent I really was. The media explosion that followed the Sterling Institute press conference exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Within 48 hours, my story had been picked up by CNN, The Washington Post, and 3 major medical journals. The angle that captured everyone's attention wasn't just the revolutionary surgical technique or the record-breaking research grant. It was the human interest story of a pioneering female surgeon who was reshaping cardiac medicine at an age when most people were considering retirement. Dr. Diana Moreau defies age barriers in medical innovation, read the headline in the New York Times Health section. The article featured a photograph of me at the podium, looking confident and authoritative, explaining the intricacies of minimally invasive cardiac surgery to a room full of medical professionals. The reporter had interviewed several of my colleagues, all of whom praised my groundbreaking work and expressed amazement at the scope of the new research project. But it was the quote from Dr. Patricia Hendricks that hit closest to home. "Dr. Moreau has been undervalued for too long. Her innovations have saved thousands of lives, and this grant finally gives her the recognition she deserves. Anyone who suggests she should retire simply doesn't understand the magnitude of her contributions to cardiac surgery." I was reading this article over my morning coffee when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's number, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Mom, we need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Good morning to you too, Marcus. Don't play games with me. What the hell do you think you're doing with all this media attention? Do you have any idea how this makes our family look?" "You mean how it makes you look when people discover that you tried to force a world-renowned cardiac surgeon into assisted living? We were trying to help you, and now you're making us look like villains to advance your own career." His accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. "Advance my career? Marcus, I've been advancing my career for 35 years. What I'm doing now is protecting it from your interference. This publicity stunt isn't going to change anything. You're still making irrational decisions, and we're still concerned about your mental state. My mental state seems to be impressing medical professionals around the world. Perhaps you should reconsider who's making irrational decisions." I hung up before he could respond, but the call had served its purpose. My children were rattled. They had expected me to fade quietly into the background, not to emerge as a prominent figure in national healthcare news. The phone rang again almost immediately. This time, it was Vincent. "Diana, this has gone far enough," he said, his voice carrying the condescending tone I remembered from our worst marital arguments. "You're embarrassing yourself and hurting the children with this vindictive campaign." "Vindictive? I'm accepting professional recognition for my life's work. How is that vindictive?" "You know exactly what you're doing. This sudden media blitz, this lawsuit Benjamin Torres filed yesterday, you're trying to punish Marcus and Sophia for caring about your welfare." So he knew about the lawsuit. Benjamin had filed the complaint the day before, alleging financial elder abuse, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The local news outlets had picked up the story, adding another layer to the narrative of the accomplished surgeon fighting back against family manipulation. Vincent, let me be very clear about something. I am not trying to punish anyone. I am protecting myself from people who have attempted to strip away my autonomy, my professional reputation, and my legal rights. The fact that those people happen to be my children makes it tragic, not vindictive. You're destroying this family over pride and ego. I'm defending this family's honor, or at least my part of it. After I hung up, I sat in my library and considered the implications of these phone calls. My legal counterattack was working exactly as I had hoped. The lawsuit and the media coverage were putting enormous pressure on Marcus and Sophia, forcing them to defend their actions publicly rather than operating in the shadows. Benjamin Torres had crafted the lawsuit brilliantly, focusing not just on the house sale but on the broader pattern of manipulation and defamation. The complaint detailed how my children had used a medical emergency to take control of my financial affairs, how they had told my colleagues I was mentally impaired without any medical evidence, and how they had attempted to dismantle my professional life while I was recovering from surgery. The defamation claim was particularly strong. By telling my professional colleagues that I was experiencing cognitive decline and needed to retire for health reasons, Marcus and Sophia had potentially damaged my reputation in ways that could have lasting career consequences. The fact that these statements were demonstrably false, as evidenced by my medical clearance and professional activities, made the case even stronger. But the lawsuit was just one front in the battle. The Vancouver conference was still 10 days away, and I was preparing a presentation that would cement my professional legacy while simultaneously demonstrating my mental acuity to anyone who still harbored doubts. I spent the next week in intensive preparation, working with a team of residents and medical students to create the most comprehensive presentation of the Moreau method ever assembled. We prepared detailed surgical videos, outcome statistics, and comparative analyses that would leave no doubt about the technique's effectiveness. Dr. Keiko Tanaka, a brilliant young cardiac surgeon who had been following my work for years, agreed to assist with the presentation. Keiko had completed her residency at Johns Hopkins and was considering several fellowship opportunities, but she was particularly interested in training with me if I established the new cardiac surgery center. Dr. Moreau, your technique could revolutionize how we approach complex valve repairs, she said as we reviewed the presentation materials. The preliminary results are incredible. Recovery times reduced by 70%. Complication rates down by half. This isn't just an improvement, it's a complete paradigm shift. That's exactly what I want the conference to understand. This isn't just another surgical modification, it's a fundamental reimagining of how cardiac surgery can be performed. Working with Keiko reminded me of why I had gone into medicine in the first place. The thrill of pushing boundaries, of finding solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable, of training the next generation of surgeons to carry the work forward. My children saw my career as an obsession that had damaged our family, but they had never understood the lives that were saved, the innovations that were developed, the legacy that was being built. 3 days before the Vancouver conference, I received an unexpected visitor. Carmen Rodriguez arrived at my door carrying a thick folder of documents and looking grimmer than I had ever seen her. "Diana, I've been investigating what happened with your house sale," she said as I invited her in. "What I found is going to make you very angry." Carmen had spent weeks documenting everything she could remember about the sale process, but she had also done something I hadn't expected. She had researched the real estate transaction records and discovered additional details about how the sale had been structured. "The house wasn't just sold below market value," she said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "Vincent and Celeste took out a mortgage for the full purchase price, then immediately refinanced using the house as collateral for a much larger loan. They essentially got the house for free and extracted additional cash from the transaction." I stared at the mortgage documents, trying to process what Carmen was telling me. They borrowed money against my house after buying it. From my children? More than that. They used the equity in your house to secure a loan for Vincent's business. Your former home is now collateral for a commercial real estate development project. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only had Vincent convinced my children to sell him my house at a massive discount, but he had immediately leveraged that house to fund his business ventures. My life's work, my sanctuary, my carefully preserved Victorian manor was now nothing more than collateral for Vincent's latest money-making scheme. There's more, Carmen continued. I spoke to the real estate agent who handled the transaction. She said she was uncomfortable with the sale from the beginning because it was so far below market value. But Marcus assured her that it was a family matter and that you had specifically requested the discounted price to help your ex-husband. Marcus told the real estate agent I requested the discount? He said you wanted to help Vincent and Celeste get established in a proper home, and that the reduced price was your way of contributing to their happiness. The lies kept multiplying. Not only had my children sold my house without my consent, but they had constructed an elaborate fiction about my motivations for doing so. They had told people I was mentally declining while simultaneously claiming I was lucid enough to make generous financial gifts to my ex-husband. Carmen, would you be willing to testify about all of this if needed? Absolutely. What they did to you was wrong, and Vincent's manipulation of the whole situation makes it even worse. That evening, I called Benjamin Torres and shared Carmen's discoveries. His response was immediate and enthusiastic. Diana, this changes everything. If Vincent used the house as collateral for business loans, and if Marcus misrepresented your intentions to the real estate agent, we have grounds for fraud charges in addition to the elder abuse claims. Fraud charges? Against my own children? They made material misrepresentations about your mental state and your intentions regarding the sale. They profited from those misrepresentations. In legal terms, that's fraud. The scope of the legal battle was expanding, but I was no longer intimidated by the complexity. My children had chosen to wage war against me using lies, manipulation, and legal machinations. I was simply responding with the truth and the full force of the law. 2 days before my departure for Vancouver, the first major medical journal. Review of my research appeared in the Journal of Cardiac Surgery. The peer review was glowing, with 3 independent cardiac surgeons praising the innovation and potential impact of the Moreau method. Dr. Moreau's technique represents the most significant advancement in minimally invasive cardiac surgery in decades, wrote Dr. Robert Chen from Stanford Medical Center. The clinical results speak for themselves: reduced morbidity, faster recovery, and expanded treatment options for patients previously considered inoperable. The review was accompanied by an editorial that placed my work in historical context, comparing the potential impact of the Moreau method to other breakthrough surgical innovations of the past century. The editorial concluded with a statement that made me smile. Dr. Moreau's contributions to cardiac surgery have been under-recognized for too long. This technique should cement her legacy as one of the pioneering surgeons of her generation. I was reading this review when my phone rang with a call from Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the Vancouver conference organizer. Diana, we need to move your presentation to the main auditorium, she said. Registration for your session has exceeded capacity by over 300%. We've never had this level of interest in a single presentation. 300%? Cardiac surgeons are flying in from around the world to hear you present the Moreau method. The medical media coverage has generated enormous interest, and everyone wants to see the technique that's being called revolutionary. The presentation was scheduled for the opening day of the conference, in the main auditorium that seated over 1,000 attendees. As the keynote speaker, I would be introducing the Moreau method to the largest gathering of cardiac surgeons in North America. But the professional recognition was only part of what made the Vancouver presentation so significant. The timing was perfect to counter any lingering questions about my mental competence or professional capabilities. My children could claim, I was declining all they wanted, but 1,000 cardiac surgeons would witness firsthand my expertise, my innovation, and my continued relevance in the field. The night before my flight to Vancouver, I received one final call from Sophia. Her voice was different, less confident, more uncertain than it had been during our recent confrontations. "Mom, I need you to know that we never meant for things to go this far," she said. "We really did think we were helping you. By selling my house? By telling people I was mentally impaired? By consulting a psychiatrist about medicating me into compliance? We were scared. When you had the heart attack, we thought we were going to lose you. And then when you came home from the hospital, you seemed so angry, so different from the mother we knew. I was angry because you had sold my house while I was unconscious. I was different because you had betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. We didn't know about your research grant or the conference or any of it. If we had known how important your work was." "You should have known," I interrupted. "You should have known because I'm your mother, and you should have paid attention to my life and my accomplishments. But you were too busy listening to your father's narrative about my failures as a wife and mother to notice my successes as a surgeon and researcher." Sophia was quiet for a long moment. "What happens now, Mom? With the lawsuit and everything? Now you face the consequences of your choices, just like I've spent my entire career facing the consequences of mine." After I hung up, I felt a mix of sadness and determination. Sophia's call suggested that my children were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had done, but their regret came too late to change the course of events they had set in motion. The next morning, I flew to Vancouver carrying the presentation that would establish the Moreau method as a landmark achievement in cardiac surgery. The plane was filled with medical professionals heading to the conference, and several recognized me from the recent news coverage. Dr. Margaret Foster, a cardiac surgeon from Toronto, approached me during the flight. "Dr. Moreau, I've been following your work for years. I'm so glad you're finally getting the recognition you deserve." "Finally?" "Your innovations have been influencing cardiac surgery practice for decades, but you've always stayed in the background. It's about time the world knew who was really behind some of our most important advances." As the plane descended into Vancouver, I looked out at the city where I would deliver the most important presentation of my career. Tomorrow, I would stand before 1,000 of my peers and present the work that represented 35 years of dedication, innovation, and sacrifice. My children had tried to erase me, to force me into invisibility and irrelevance. Instead, they had motivated me to claim my rightful place in medical history. The war they had started was about to reach its climax, and I was going to win it, decisively. The standing ovation began before I even finished my presentation. As I clicked through the final slides showing the remarkable patient outcomes achieved through the Moreau method, the entire auditorium erupted in applause that lasted nearly 5 minutes. 1,000 of the world's most accomplished cardiac surgeons were on their feet, recognizing not just the revolutionary technique I had developed, but the decades of quiet innovation that had led to this moment. Dr. Elizabeth Chen had to return to the podium 3 times to restore order before the question and answer session could begin. The inquiries that followed were sophisticated and probing, exactly the kind of rigorous scientific scrutiny that separated genuine medical breakthroughs from surgical fads. "Dr. Moreau," asked Dr. James Patterson from the Mayo Clinic, "your long-term outcome data suggests this technique could be applied to conditions we've traditionally considered inoperable. What are the limitations of the method?" "The primary limitation is surgeon skill level," I replied confidently. "The Moreau method requires extensive training and precise technique. That's why the Sterling Institute grant will focus heavily on education and certification programs." Dr. Sarah Kim from Seoul National University raised her hand. "How long have you been developing this approach?" 15 years of research and refinement. The technique has evolved through careful analysis of over 2,000 procedures. What You're seeing today represents the culmination of my life's work in cardiac surgery. As the session concluded, I was surrounded by colleagues eager to discuss collaboration opportunities, training programs, and research partnerships. The response was overwhelming and validating in ways I had never experienced. For the first time in my career, I was receiving recognition that matched the significance of my contributions to the field. Dr. Michael Torres from Harvard Medical approached me as the crowd began to thin. "Diana, that was extraordinary. I've been performing cardiac surgery for 25 years, and I've never seen anything with this potential for transforming patient outcomes." "Thank you, Michael. I hope you'll consider sending residents to train in the method once we establish the certification program." "I'd like to be one of the first surgeons trained myself," he said. "This isn't just about teaching residents. This is about revolutionizing how we approach cardiac surgery at every level." The medical press conference that followed was unlike anything I had experienced. Reporters from journals around the world asked detailed questions about the technique, its development, and its implications for cardiac surgery practice. The questions were respectful but thorough, reflecting the genuine scientific interest the presentation had generated. When a reporter from Medical News International asked about my plans for retirement, I smiled. "Retirement? I've just received the largest research grant in cardiac surgery and developed a technique that could help millions of patients worldwide. This feels more like the beginning of the most productive phase of my career." The coverage that followed, the Vancouver presentation exceeded even the response to the Sterling Institute announcement. Within 24 hours, the Moreau method was being discussed in medical journals, healthcare publications, and mainstream news outlets around the world. The narrative was no longer about an aging surgeon fighting family manipulation. It was about a pioneering medical innovator whose breakthrough technique would save countless lives. But the professional triumph was just the beginning of the transformation that was unfolding in my life. 2 weeks after returning from Vancouver, Benjamin Torres called with news about the lawsuit. "Diana, Vincent's attorneys want to schedule a settlement conference. Marcus and Sophia are prepared to offer significant financial compensation to resolve the elder abuse and defamation claims." "What kind of compensation?" "They're offering to pay you the full market value difference on the house sale, $550,000, plus damages for the defamation. Vincent would also have to refinance the property to remove your former home as collateral for his business loans." The offer was substantial, but money had never been the primary motivation for the lawsuit. "What about admitting wrongdoing?" "They're willing to issue a public statement acknowledging that they acted without fully understanding your professional circumstances, and that their statements about your mental capacity were unfounded." A public acknowledgement of what they had done was exactly what I needed to complete the restoration of my professional reputation. Anyone who had heard the rumors about my cognitive decline would see a clear retraction from the people who had originated those lies. "I'll accept the settlement, but I want the statement published in the local newspapers and medical journals where the defamatory statements were made. I'll negotiate those terms." 3 days later, the settlement was finalized. The public statement appeared in the Portland Observer, the Oregon Medical Association newsletter, and several other publications. The text was carefully worded but unambiguous. Marcus and Sophia Moreau acknowledged that their statements regarding their mother's mental capacity and professional competence were made without adequate medical foundation and do not reflect Dr. Diana Moreau's actual condition or capabilities. The financial settlement was deposited into my account the same day the statement was published. $500,000 in compensation for the house sale, plus additional damages for defamation and emotional distress. The money would be useful for establishing the new cardiac surgery center, but the public vindication was far more valuable. With the legal battle resolved, I could focus entirely on the extraordinary opportunities that were emerging from the recognition of my work. The Sterling Institute had accelerated the timeline for establishing the new cardiac surgery center, with construction beginning on a state-of-the-art facility that would serve as the global headquarters for Moreau method training and research. Dr. Keiko Tanaka had formally accepted my offer to serve as associate director of the new center, bringing her expertise in advanced cardiac imaging to complement the surgical innovations we were developing. We had also recruited a team of the most promising young cardiac surgeons from around the world, creating an environment of innovation and collaboration that reminded me why I had entered medicine in the first place. The center would be located in Portland, just 20 minutes from my Edwardian home, allowing me to maintain the life I had built while pursuing the most ambitious project of my career. The irony was perfect. My children had tried to force me into assisted living in Oregon, and instead, I was establishing Oregon as the global center for advanced cardiac surgery training. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the transformation in my relationship with my children. The public recognition of my professional achievements had forced Marcus and Sophia to confront the reality of who their mother actually was, rather than the diminished version they had constructed in their minds. Sophia was the first to reach, out after the settlement was finalized. She called on a Saturday morning, her voice tentative and uncertain. "Mom, I saw the article in the medical journal about the new surgery center. It sounds incredible." "Thank you. We're very excited about the potential impact." I wanted to apologize again for everything that happened. We really didn't understand what we were taking away from you. "No, you didn't. But perhaps now you're beginning to see who I am beyond your role as my daughter. Would it be possible for me to visit? I'd like to see your new house and hear about the work you're doing." The request surprised me, but I found myself genuinely curious about whether we could rebuild our relationship on a more honest foundation. "I'd like that, Sophia." Marcus took longer to acknowledge what had happened, but when he finally called, his apology was more comprehensive and thoughtful than I had expected. "Mom, I need you to know that I understand now what we did to you. Not just the house sale, but the whole pattern of dismissing your achievements and treating you like you were declining. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." "What changed your perspective?" "Seeing you at that press conference, reading about your research, understanding what the Moreau method actually represents, I realized I never really knew who my mother was professionally. I knew you were a surgeon, but I didn't know you were a pioneering surgeon whose work was changing the field. That's because you were more interested in your father's version of my life than in discovering the truth for yourself." "You're right. And I want to do better going forward if you'll let me." The conversations with my children were the beginning of a slow process of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and Vincent's manipulation. It would take time to establish trust and genuine connection. But for the first time in years, I was hopeful about the possibility of having authentic relationships with Marcus and Sophia. Vincent, predictably, never acknowledged his role in orchestrating the betrayal. He continued to portray himself as a concerned ex-husband who had simply tried to help his children care for their aging mother. But his influence over Marcus and Sophia had been broken by the public revelation of my professional stature and the legal consequences of their actions. Celeste, surprisingly, was the most forthright about what had happened. She called me directly 3 months after the settlement, her voice full of genuine remorse. "Dr. Moreau, I need to apologize for my part in what happened to you. I knew the house was worth more than we paid for it, and I knew Vincent was manipulating the situation to get what he wanted." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've left Vincent. The way he treated you, the lies he told, the way he used your children against you, I couldn't stay married to someone capable of that level of cruelty." Celeste's departure from Vincent was the final confirmation of what I had known all along. His actions had been motivated by greed and vindictiveness, not concern for my welfare. The marriage that had cost me my first family had ultimately destroyed itself through Vincent's own manipulative behavior. 6 months after the Vancouver presentation, I stood in the lobby of the newly completed Diana Moreau Center for Advanced Cardiac Surgery. The facility was everything I had envisioned: cutting-edge surgical suites, advanced research laboratories, and comfortable accommodations for the surgeons who would come from around the world to learn the techniques we were developing. The center's grand opening was covered by medical journals and news outlets internationally. The ceremony was attended by cardiac surgeons, medical researchers, and healthcare leaders from 6 continents. The keynote speaker was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who had become not just a colleague but a friend. "The Diana Moreau Center represents more than just a new medical facility," she said to the assembled crowd. "It represents the triumph of innovation over convention, of persistence over obstacles, of excellence over attempts to diminish and dismiss." As I listened to her words, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I had been a successful but under-recognized surgeon whose own children had seen her as a burden to be managed. Today, I was the director of the world's most advanced cardiac surgery training center, with my name permanently attached to techniques that would save lives for generations to come. The personal cost had been significant. My relationship with my children, while improving, would never fully recover from the betrayal and the legal battle that followed. The family I had sacrificed so much to preserve had been irreparably damaged by the actions of its members. But from that destruction had emerged something unprecedented: a life lived entirely on my own terms, with recognition that matched my contributions and opportunities that reflected my capabilities. I was no longer defined by my roles as wife, mother, or support system for others' ambitions. I was Dr. Diana Moreau, pioneering cardiac surgeon, medical innovator, and director of an institution that would advance the field I had devoted my life to improving. The transformation was complete. My children had tried to erase me, and instead they had forced me to claim my rightful place in medical history. They had attempted to diminish me, and instead they had motivated me to achieve the greatest success of my career. At 63, I was not winding down toward retirement. I was just getting started on the most meaningful phase of my professional life. The Moreau method was being implemented in hospitals around the world. The training center was attracting the most talented young surgeons internationally, and the research projects we were developing would push the boundaries of cardiac surgery for decades to come. The woman who had been betrayed while lying unconscious in a hospital bed had become the most influential cardiac surgeon of her generation. My children had taught me that family loyalty could not be taken for granted, but they had also taught me that my own worth was not dependent on their recognition or approval. I had learned to fight for myself with the same fierce dedication I had always shown when fighting for my patients. And in doing so, I had discovered that the most important battle of my life was not against heart disease or surgical complications, but against the forces that sought to diminish my voice, my achievements, and my right to determine my own destiny. The victory was complete, the transformation irreversible, and the future entirely mine to design. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.